Thank you, Vivian, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. For those who haven't met me before, my name is Lee Rosebush. In addition to working at Baker Hostetler, the law firm, I also have the honor of serving as the chairman of the Outsourcing Facility Association, better known as the OFA. It's the 503B Trade Association. With me today, I have three prestigious panelists, and I'm hoping that each of you can take a few seconds to introduce yourselves. So, Tom, if you could start.
Yes, I'm Tom Kupiec. I'm the CEO at ARL Biopharma. It's a pharmaceutical testing company that's FDA inspected and audited, and we do work for both compounding pharmacies as well as big pharma, research institutions. And so you look at the drug pipeline from early stage through formulation and testing, we tend to do a fair amount of testing in those departments and arenas. We also have a genetics company, which has turned out to be very useful, especially with the new direction from gene therapy, cell therapy, and testing has changed in the last few years for the large molecules of biologics. And then we do a fair amount of consulting in different forensic matters, and that's what the Kupiec Group has. And thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure.
And Ian and Gabby, did you want to take a few quick seconds?
I'm a division director within FDA CDER, within the Office of Compliance, in the subordinate Office of Manufacturing Quality. One of the primary responsibilities within the group is to enforcement of the FD&C Act, specifically Section 501 concerning adulteration of drug products.
And my name is Cosel, and I'm acting senior advisor for compounding in CDER's Office of Compliance, and I work on a number of stakeholder engagements and policy initiatives related to drug compounding, and worked on FDA regulatory policy matters prior to FDA from the nonprofit side as well. So a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. And the idea behind today's panel is really just to have an open discussion and dialogue. Obviously, we're going to try and get into as much as we can. The world has changed dramatically since COVID-19 came about in March and April time period. It's hard to remember a time period going back before all of this had started. But what we were hoping to do is get some ideas and understand here better understanding of how things have changed and where we think things are going, both from an FDA perspective, an industry, 503A and 503B side, as well as the unique side of being testing and development from Tom. And so the couple of objectives that we do have is to identify how compounding pharmacies and outsourcing facilities have helped during this pandemic. And as I mentioned a minute ago, to compare and contrast how that relationship was prior to and how things going forward here. And then finally, some of the lessons that we have learned moving forward. Obviously, this pandemic has created several new and complex issues for both the agency and the industry. And Gabby and Ian, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to start with you here. How have you seen both compounding pharmacies from a 503A and outsourcing 503B side help during this pandemic movement?
So I'll take that one. So one of the things that, in terms of the agency at the beginning of the pandemic is put out a number of guidances guiding current agency thinking on regulatory discretion given both towards 503A and 503B to help bridge the gap of various drugs and shortages. The guidances themselves specifically deal with those used to treat COVID patients. Majority of them are used to treat patients that were intubated. So once the guidance were issued, we did have conversations with 503A, 503B's, individual facilities. We've had it with associations in terms of getting the information out to these organizations, answering any questions that they may have, and using that, we have seen the industry, and in particular 503Bs, rise to the occasion and help bridge the gap and meet some of the shortages caused by the pandemic. Gaby, do you want to add anything?
Perhaps just to say that, this is obviously an ongoing public health emergency, and supply challenges and shortages continue to be at hand. So I think many of the drugs that are named in our guidances regarding compounding during the pandemic are still in shortage on FDA's drug shortage list. I think this has more to do with the exigencies of the pandemic than how compounders have been able to help, in particular outpatient facilities you mentioned. We've certainly seen that there's been good engagement and a lot of interest and willingness among the outpatient facility sector to try to bridge the gap, as Ian said, and supply these drugs when needed to patients.
Thank you. And I know when I say we here, I'm meaning the industry itself, not necessarily the three of us or four of us here during this conversation. But I know one of the things that we have seen is sort of the progression, right, and the continued development of the 503B industry to sort of be, as we've mentioned before, not combative, but complementary to pharma, in particular with some of these drug shortages. And I know that drug shortages aren't necessarily a new issue, is the best way to put it. But as we continue to see COVID change, right, and the treatment regimens change with COVID, I'm assuming that those drugs on the Appendix A list and those that are in the shortage list will continue to evolve as well. I wanted to get your both opinions and ideas on whether or not you think that Appendix A list may be a continual evolving issue. And as we move forward with different treatment regimens, dexamethasone is a perfect example of something that just came about over the last 6 weeks or so with steroids in the treatment. How do you see 503Bs being able to continue to help with those evolving treatment regimens?
I can start, and Ian can join as well. But I think that we certainly envision an ongoing process to continue to evaluate the list referenced in the guidance and make sure that it's the appropriate list given, our best information about what's going on with the supply situation on the ground and what hospitals need and what they can't get. So absolutely, we continue to look at that, and we'll continue to do so. And as you know, some of the particular flexibilities in the guidance were added with an eye to helping, for the outpatient facility guidance particularly, helping those facilities enter the market perhaps slightly more quickly than they might otherwise be able to do, given the acute needs that we saw earlier this spring, and some of which still continue. So we also look at the guidance itself and look at the policies therein and continue to look there to make sure that they're still achieving what we want them to achieve on an ongoing matter as well.
Got it.
For me, the only thing I can emphasize is that the agency is continuously monitoring the situation on the ground and discuss whether or not a particular drug product should go on the Appendix A list. This is an ongoing.
Okay. And I know, Ian and Gab, you may not be able to talk about specific drugs, and I don't want to put you in a position to talk about specific drugs in this, based on the specific question. But as progression and as treatment regimens change moving forward, what kind of factors does the agency take into consideration as they start to look at the evolving changes to that Appendix A list or differences in shortages? Because one of the things that obviously we've always talked about in the past, and again, we as an industry here, is ASHP's list and FDA's drug shortage list, and now we have the Appendix A list, and there's a lot of overlap between a lot of that, right, as expected. But not every drug is on every single one. And so is there areas that the agency tends to focus on and look at as we start to evolve more with the treatments for COVID?
So we've really focused on some of the inputs we've been getting, from stakeholders in the space, from hospitals, and others that have been reporting to us, where their needs have been most acute. and drugs that they may not be able to get. And as you know, our list includes a lot of drugs that are on FDA's drug shortage list, but that's not a full overlap there. And we did that because given the exigencies of the situation, we felt it was necessary to accommodate certain drugs that may not be on FDA's drug shortage list yet, or due to the information that we had about their availability in certain areas and disruptions in supply that may be related to really unique circumstances of this pandemic. And what I was going to say next. We also do a lot of internal consultation, and we have a lot of folks, as you might imagine, working at the agency across the board with expertise on various matters, including treatment regimens and the like, pharmaceutical quality as well. And so we do a lot of internal consultation with our internal experts to come to decisions about what might make sense to add.
Thanks. And Tom, I know that you're sort of in a unique position here. As we've talked about, drugs are being considered. And for example, I go back to the dexamethasone example as a drug that's been added to that Appendix A list. As you start to see drugs added, obviously 503Bs and As start to consider new formulations. So what have you seen changing during this pandemic, both from a testing perspective and as drugs start to move faster? What have you seen that's included in that moving forward? What kind of changes have you seen?
I think the greatest change that we have seen recently is in regard to the hand sanitizer. And I'm pleased that the FDA has came out with the notices from the impurity issue of the methanol and 1-propanol, because it's a little confusing in just the nomenclature itself and in the testing. For instance, alcohol in the USP monograph is referring to ethanol, but the issues of methanol and 1-propanol are also classified are alcohols. I mean, even 1-propanol, like isopropanol, 1-propanol, 2-propanol, that may be confusing to the non-chemist or the non-scientific individual. So I think the idea that the relaxing or releasing of some of those restrictions or guidelines for the compounding pharmacists or pharmacies to be able to make that, but they should, anytime something's been made, it needs to maintain the best quality without affecting adversely that patient. And I think by the FDA finding these and then bringing these guidance documents, even as late as just from the last couple of weeks, I think is beneficial. So I know we're seeing more interest in the testing. And just for the clarification, it's helped from these notices, they'll say, let's look at alcohol. So they'll say, test it. Well, are they looking at ethanol? Or are you looking at isopropanol? And I think, the USP compounding monographs call for using either ethanol or isopropanol, depending upon the monographs, but other types of alcohol should not be used in preparing these hand sanitizers. So as they're looking at that raw bulk initial ingredient that has these impurities, it's important to look at those, look at the appropriate testing methodologies, at the appropriate cutoffs and guidelines. That's probably the largest. That's probably the largest. Now, there are other areas that we're aware of from compounders helping during this pandemic outside of testing that I'm aware of that are some of the clients may be performing and acting on behalf.
No, that's extremely helpful. And you brought up a point that I'd kind of like to dig into a little bit further, which goes a little bit above and beyond COVID, but it touches it, right? As we continue to move forward with new products and new treatment regimens, you're getting new formulations, as we've been talking about here for a while. And one of the talking points over the last 4 or 5 years when it comes to the 503B world relates to bulk compounding. And it's really related to safety, right, in the review process and NDA and ANDAs as compared to using bulk processes and bulk powders for compounding in a 503B space. You mentioned some of the changes, methanol to ethanol. We can get into the specific gravity test, et cetera, as to some of those that have previously been used, which may not necessarily catch it. How have you seen that progression, particularly for bulk products, as we've seen new formulations move forward? And have those temp guidances that came out for COVID over the last few months started to change things?
Wow, that's like 5 questions. So, you know, I think just the idea that we brought up early on of you're seeing the 503B responding. I think, let me step back and look at the bigger, and I'll go from general to specific. I think in general, you're seeing compounding pharmacies helping during this pandemic by providing, well, the PPE, gloves, as well as compounding the hand sanitizer solutions and gels as recommended. They've also continued to compound drugs that are short supply, both from the ambulatory and hospitalized patients. I think another area they've worked with the COVID-19 testing facilities and supported those testing by allowing the use of their facilities or parking lots for the testing. I think the compounding pharmacies are available more locally in the community, and they can rapidly respond to a situation as that FDA relaxes some of those restrictions. And so I think from that perspective, a compounding pharmacy plays an important role. Now, as you go through that process and you look at that 503B, which is looking at much greater GMP quality systems and process, that's not saying that 503A does not, because I think it's dangerous to put all things to all people in a group. But I think in general, any drug that's being given to a patient, the most critical aspect is that positive patient outcomes and getting that drug without sacrificing the quality. And so there are definitely, we know from the bulk substances or the FDA approved commercial products that these topics were discussed yesterday when I believe Gail mentioned it in the first keynote discussion. I think a lot of good points came out of that. So it's necessary to maintain the quality of that bulk drug product, and one can perform those extensive tests in the USP or the JP or the European Pharmacopoeia. I mean, there are many well-documented quality tests for bulk, and one should follow based upon the regulations and guidelines, whether it be state or federal or international, such as the ICH, as we talked yesterday.
No, that's extremely helpful. And I know from our side, when I talk to most of my members, right, from the 503B space, they often come back and say, look, the idea behind 503Bs was we're statutorily developed and made through the DQSA to help resolve drug shortages. And what better time to look at drug shortages than during this pandemic? And at this pandemic, in this situation, one of the biggest concerns is how do you move faster to be able to help resolve issues. I know when it comes to, we'll just use one drug, hydroxychloroquine. We're not going to get into the politics of whether it does work or whether it doesn't work. None of that really matters for this conversation. But what does matter for this conversation is nobody would have expected the demand for that type of product 6 months ago as to what it was a couple of months ago. And in order to move that fast, or use another one, dexamethasone, to be able to help resolve those types of shortages, you need that flexibility with some of those products. And the FDA, to their credit, has stepped up, right? To Ian and Gabby, what they were mentioning earlier, has helped in that situation to be able to help resolve some of that. But those policies, hopefully, have been able to show the need to be able to move quicker to help resolve some of the needs, to where then FDA-registered manufacturers with approved product could then step in to be able to help resolve those needs after the 503Bs have helped fill the gap. In speaking of that, and Ian and Gabby, to sort of put you on the spot based on that comment, I know over the past couple of years it seems that FDA's actions on bulk drugs is to limit compounding from bulk, right? Is to sort of limit it to that specific list that we can talk about, or the temp list. I know that you're limited on what you can and can't say for this, but how has your view changed based on experiences during COVID, particularly for that issue?
Sure, I can start. I think, just to link it back to the broader context of shortages that you were raising, Lee, I think, obviously during COVID-19, we've seen supply disruptions for drugs to treat really sick folks. And some of these products are on the shortage list, some of them are not. And of course, we already have legal pathways for outsourcing facilities to use bulk substances to compound drugs that are on our shortage list. And in our temporary policy, we sort of effectively extended this for products that appear on the list reference in that guidance. And of course, we also provide flexibility in that guidance for the essentially copy provisions including for a 90-day period after a product is removed from that list. So, all this to say, what we're thinking about when we're doing this is we understand that there's a significant lead time when an outsourcing facility is first developing a process to make a drug, including when they're making that drug from a bulk, and that, it's reasonable that folks will consider this when they're deciding whether to make a shortage drug, and also considering how long that drug might remain in shortage, and all of these things come to bear. We understand that. We certainly heard that. And so, what I can say is that we really appreciate the ongoing dialogue on that subject with the industry, and we definitely want that dialogue to continue to inform, how we look at this and think about this. So.
Well, thank you. And Ian, to put you on the spot, did you have anything else to add?
No, it's okay. I fully expected. So nothing I can particularly add to Gaby's comment. I understand that to go from to start making a product from a bulk drug substance with minimal understanding of the quality of that, qualification of the vendor, what tests are required, the specifications of that regarding the product you're making, is a time-consuming process. And, I understand there's a considerable amount of lead time. The intent of the guidance was to shorten that, but I understand it doesn't eliminate that.
No, I appreciate that. And I mean, that to me, go ahead.
I'm sorry. And just to continue from what Gaby said, is appreciate the ongoing dialogue and to see if there is a way that we can move forward. So encourage the continued dialogue.
Well, thank you. And obviously, as an association, we represent those who compound from bulk, and we represent those who compound from finished products. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask the question and bring it up as well. Gabby, a minute ago, you mentioned on the guidances, the temp guidances, that it's not just the bulk, but it's the essential copy as well. And one of the things, obviously, as new formulations and new products come forward, for new treatments, I should say, for this COVID, that is one of the things that I know we as an industry, right, not just as an OFA, but we as the industry also help, right? I don't want to make it sound like it's just for the bulk protections, but also the essential copy protections for those products that also could be done from finished product. And so those are also questions and concerns, and I'm curious if you had any thoughts related to not just the bulk side, but also the essential copy protections, particularly for those from finished product that are used to treat COVID.
Well, I think sort of broadly on that, when we developed the temporary guidances, I think what we were thinking about on that front was just to ensure that if we felt that it was necessary to add a drug to our list, that the flexibilities were going to create the appropriate space for outsourcing facilities for this particular guidance to help with the supply. And copies, of course, relevant to that. And in particular, we looked at the timing as well. And as you know, there's sort of a difference in the temporary guidance, the amount of time allowed to produce a drug under the temporary policy versus what's considered under the our guidance on copies. So that's really the lens we looked at it for the temporary guidance, to make sure that we were hitting the right mark in terms of helping create the right space for outsourcing facilities to be able to do this, given the public health emergency.
Well, thank you. And I know that both you and Ian mentioned the conversations and the ongoing dialogue, and I know that we as an industry have greatly appreciated that over the last couple of months. And as somebody who's served back in the FDA almost 15 years ago, I guess over 15 years ago at this point, and then somebody who's been on the outside, I know many on the outside often consider the FDA sort of as a black box when it comes to the actions that it takes and sort of the conversations and communications back and forth. To your credit, and as we both have mentioned, there seems to have been a lot more interaction and transparency during COVID, and for obvious reasons. What has your impressions been during this pandemic, and what are some of the takeaways that you found most helpful during this time?
Ian, do you want to?
So, yeah, I can take that. So, yeah, our impression, all I can say is since March, I've engaged in more stakeholder meetings. Either sometimes it's felt like a weekly or daily basis. So, to meet the pandemic, the agency has been, and me specifically, have been made ourselves available or requested various conversations with the outsourcing facilities, the 503Bs Association, state boards of pharmacies, other associations. So we're doing whatever we can to make sure that the patient needs are being met, and that the people who are able to meet to bridge the shortage gaps have access to us, understand what our thinking is, and our requests for what the requests that are being made to us, so we can consider it. So we've been actively doing this more so than my my previous experience.
Yeah, and I just add that we found it, I think, very helpful, these conversations that we've been able to have during this time, and really necessary given the critical situation that we've had in this country, and have really appreciated the willingness of folks from the outsourcing facility sector and other stakeholders to be candid with us and sort of share their on-the-ground reality, lead times and the like, all sorts of information that's really been extremely helpful to us as we've tried to navigate this as well. So it's been appreciated.
Well, if I can sort of flip it a little bit, I say, what would you like to have seen done differently at this point?
It's a sort of a hard question to answer. I think that this has been a very evolving landscape, and we've seen things happen in terms of supply levels, real time, and tried to react as best we can. And I think I would just, in terms of lessons learned, circle back to just how valuable, as we both just mentioned, the dialogue has been, and the increased communication with stakeholders across the board on this. That's been a very clear benefit and value.
Thank you. And Ian, I'll put you on the spot again.
Go for it.
How about you? Is there anything that surprised you? Anything that you wish you would have seen or had been done differently at this point? I know we've talked an awful lot about the communications and how they've been helpful, but is there anything that you would have done differently from at this point, or anything that sort of surprised you based on those communications and what's gone on through COVID?
I can't think of anything in retrospect that I would have done differently. It would maybe perhaps if the relationships between the agency and the various stakeholders were more solid prior to going into the pandemic, that might have made things a little bit easier to do. Other than that, I can't think of anything differently other than, again, what happened before the pandemic hit. And regarding anything surprised me, there are certain times that I think my intuition is pretty strong. So things have happened that I fully expect, I was not surprised. So.
Okay. That's helpful. And Tom, how about you? What have your impressions been during this COVID? Has anything surprised you with the interactions and what's been going on, both from an industry side as well as interactions with the agency?
Well, I think the interactions have been positive from the agency. I mean, there's been fewer restrictions on compounding, which has provided compounders with the ability to better stock with the bulk APIs on hand, allowing more compounding or more data and more innovative equipment to be used to respond quicker to the clients, to the patients. I'm not an expert or tend to that comment or opinion on the regulatory side or the compliance side. I'm more the science or technical aspect of it. And I look at, if we're going to test whatever it is, hydroxychloroquine or whatever it is, it's going to follow the guidelines, it's going to follow the monographs, it's going to follow the certain procedures and policies as far as the testing methodology.
That's helpful. How about from the lessons? What lessons have you taken away from this? Bless you.
Excuse me. Are you asking me what lessons I've taken away from this?
Yes.
Well, it's really fortunate in that I think that, well, I tell you, I think that we need to collaborate, not just in this matter, but we're in a pandemic, and the United States hasn't responded as well as it should have. And I think we have to work together, regardless of the political or any of these other issues, economic issues. We need to base our decisions upon science and evidence-based, and the compliance or regulatory should mimic and come in hand with those pieces. So my perspective is, hopefully we see, the science should reveal the truth. And as you're looking at this as a risk base, everything has a risk. And, I think it shows that we have to be more collaborative. I really think to be competitive in this society, not just the nation, but a global community, we need to be more collaborative together. And I think what we have seen is as Gaby and Eda is talking about, the appreciation for the communication and dialogue back and forth, I think that needs to continue going forward. It's not lessons we've learned, because we can always look back. Yes, we should learn, but how do we go forward to a better, more working together for the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And this is an issue, and how can this pandemic needs of the patient be met, whether by a commercial drug, a combination of a commercial drug, or a compounding pharmacy, or a hospital situation, or a home health care, without sacrificing the quality.
That's helpful. Ian and Gabby, I'll put you on the spot. From an agency perspective, what lessons do you wish industry learned during this pandemic, and what lessons have you learned?
At risk of sounding like a broken record, I think I have to go back to what I said earlier, just about the real value that the increase in communication has, I think, had for us, and then I think it's been good on both sides to have more of that exchange, and it's certainly been very, very helpful to us to have this much more real-time information about matters of supply of certain products and production of those products. It's really been essential for us. So that's certainly a big lesson learned.
And Ian,
No, the only thing is, again, to be the broken record of the communication that has occurred during this time, and that is continuing during this time, is to go forward with it. As I don't know when this whole pandemic will be resolved, when things will be able to go back to the way they were January and February. I'm not a prognosticator. But in terms of maintaining this level of collaboration and communication in terms of going forward.
That's helpful. And we actually had a question come in for you, Ian and Gabby. I'm hoping that you have an answer to this one. So the question specifically is, how has communication changed between industry and compounding pharmacies, whether it be an A or B, and the end users, whether it be hospitals, retail pharmacies, providers, etc., during this time?
So I don't know if we have sort of full visibility into the sort of hospital and outsourcing facility, or other compounding communications. Lee, you might have more, frankly, given where you sit. So you might have to.
And one of the things that I can say this from an association's perspective, right? So we've created the website, not to self-plug, 503bs.org, 503bs.org, which has the whole list of those from Appendix A and the drug shortage list. So I know that that is out there now for hospitals and providers to be able to go to and see what 503Bs, even if you're not a member of the association, right? We've reached out to everyone to say, okay, where and who are making these, and that material was either combed directly from the product reports that they report to the FDA or from the direct reach outs that we have at this point. I know one of the other things that we have done as an association, right, is to reach out to the GPOs and sort of have those conversations as well. I know that we've provided as an association now directly some of that information to you as the FDA, and so that is one of the things obviously that we're monitoring as well from a GPO perspective and access side. Outside of that, I know I'd be remiss if I didn't ask things that are going forward, right? So we've talked an awful lot about lessons that we've learned and things that we have tried to pick up on and how we as an industry can be complementary to, not combative for a lot of these issues. But moving forward with this, obviously we're still in a world with COVID and we still have limited access to a lot of things. And I know that there's some limitations as to what you can and can't say, obviously, when it comes to inspections and policies and things like that that may be coming down the road. But do you have any insight as to even how inspections may resume? Right? I know the FDA has released guidances, and there's been some discussions on whether they'll just be all virtual or whether or not there'll be some on site or if it'll be certain locations based on COVID counts. But can you go into a little bit of that?
Well, I mean, I can start with, and I think Gail touched on this briefly yesterday as well, but, what's been publicly shared, on July 10th, FDA announced we're preparing to resume domestic inspections guided by a new risk assessment system. And there's a roadmap from the White House on how to optimize those operations and work arrangements, and it's a CDC guidance as well. So this is in the works. We've also developed, I understand, a rating system, our Office of Regulatory Affairs, to determine when and where it's safest to prioritize domestic inspections based on risk level given the pandemic. So the idea of all of this is sort of in a managed risk-based way to, in instances, resume on-site inspections. I can't comment on the ideas in the question about desk audits or virtual right now, but I can say what I just said about the on-site.
One of the things, and again, I know you may not be able to answer a whole lot of this, both you or Ian, the situation, but one of the things I know that we have raised as an association, right, on behalf of the industry, is from a risk calculation, areas that go above and beyond just product and 483s. For example, state licensing, right? Some of the states require that FDA come in every 2 years, for example, to do inspections before they'll issue another state license, or some of the GPO contracts who say, you have to be inspected, et cetera. Is other factors besides past inspections and the type of products they make, things like state licensing that we mentioned, for considered in some of those risk calculations, or is it really truly based going forward just on the products that were made in past 43s from a risk calculation perspective?
So I think, and I'm not from our Office of Regulatory Affairs, so I don't want to speak out of school, but I think the risk assessment system in terms of resuming the on-site inspections, that at least a portion of it, related to COVID-19 has more to do with disease exposure than the other matters that we might otherwise use to prioritize inspections. So I think the new piece of that is about the disease exposure piece. Ian, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
There's nothing we can add to that. In terms of when the inspections, there's nothing. When the inspections will resume, there's nothing. I have no more information than Gaby presented. I will point out that inspections and desk audits are considered two different types of activities. So a desk audit, of course, should not be seen as an inspection. Other people may interpret that as up to them, but from the agency perspective, a desk audit is not synonymous with an inspection. It's not a subcategory of an inspection.
That's helpful, yeah. Outside of the inspections, I guess the other area that I'd like to touch about where things are heading post-COVID, obviously we've talked a lot about lessons learned and temporary policies, but moving forward with this pandemic or, God forbid, another pandemic that comes to treat the next one, what type of policy issues are really a priority for the FDA going forward?
So as you know, we can't share things we haven't already shared publicly, although we have previously publicly stated that guidance specific to hospital compounding and our guidance on sanitary conditions are a priority. So that continues to be a priority for us. I think that's as much as I can say.
Okay. Ian, did you have anything to add?
I do not.
Okay. How about you, Tom? From a policy perspective, what policy changes would you like to see moving forward? And is there any that you would like to see made permanent that were part of the temp policies?
Well, I think with the experience obtained over the past several months, it should be apparent that many of the compounding pharmacies, the 503A can respond to these emergencies faster and provide needed services to the public with short turnaround time in a comprehensive manner. I think the policy is not my expert, but I would think working hand in hand with the pharmacies and the regulatory bodies to ensure that that patient has that good quality product is paramount. And I don't know the solution to that or how, but I think each of us come to it with our own inherent biases. But I think sometimes we need to put that aside and at least look at the other perspective for the betterment of the patient. So, but that cannot occur with mitigating or minimizing the quality aspect of that drug dosage form.
No, that's helpful. And one of the things that we have seen as an industry, I mean, even over the last 2 weeks or so, is people putting financial interest sort of above, particularly for even COVID-based drugs, right, moving forward. Some lawsuits have been filed, and I won't go into details with a lot of that, even over the last 2 weeks, that were specific for products that were compounded both from bulk and finished product. It didn't matter on behalf of pharma, for products that were specifically used to treat COVID patients. And so to me, that is one of the things that stands out from a policy perspective, right? Again, speaking on behalf of the industry side of things here, is that people are putting financial interest in front of patient interest, particularly for when it comes to COVID. You've heard of the government taking actions with increasing costs when it comes to PPE. You heard of the government taking actions when it comes to increasing cost and monopolies and overcharging for other items when it comes to treatment for COVID. Now, all of a sudden, you're seeing pharma do the same thing with particular products, even for those that are trying to do it for finished product, and it's basically trying to say it's an essential copy, now increasing their cost 3 and 4 and 5 times compared to what's commercially available, again, putting that financial interest in front. And so that's one of the things that I would hope, right, from a policy change going forward, that those types of protections are considered and patient interest and access are put forward first when it comes to things. I know we've got a comment that came through from Robert. Vivian, did you want to unmute Robert so he could make his comment?
He may have. Can you hear me?
Yep. Gotcha.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, super. Hi, Robert MacArthur. Yeah, in this forum, Lee, you mentioned in the same sentence the ASHP drug shortage list and the FDA drug shortage list. And I'm a hospital pharmacy director and have been one for, over 20 years. So I just wanted to comment that over at least the past 10 years, the drug shortages wax and wane on a per product basis. But when I look at the drug shortage lists, after, let's say, I can't find a product, I will almost always find that the ASHP picked up the drug shortage on their list. And the for reasons I understand are not, there's different priorities. They're not on the FDA list. So I just, wanted to bring up the idea that the ASHP list, I do think reflects what we in hospitals and acute care settings are up against when it comes to getting some of these drug products. I just thought I'd reinforce your comment or add a little detail there. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Ian and Gabby, did you have any comment?
Well, not necessarily with respect to comparing the lists, but just did want to note that ASHP is a very important stakeholder, generally speaking, and we communicate with them, quite a bit on matters related to compounding, and certainly now during COVID to make sure we're, getting good channels of information on what the hospital impact has been. So we're definitely in touch with ASHP on a regular basis.
Ian, did you have anything to add?
No, I'm at those same meetings.
Okay. And I know Ian and Gabby, my comments won't come as any surprise to you because we've submitted them in written comment before based on some of our conversations. But Robert, that's one of the things I agree with you 100% on, is that obviously there are drugs that are on ASHP's list that I feel should be added to FDA's drug shortage list, or because they may be on ASHP's drug shortage list, not FDA's, because of certain reasons, whether it be wholesalers who don't have the product, whether it be back orders, for example, regional issues. And one of the things that we have often said as the OFA is that particularly for shortage products, right, there should be potentially the opportunity to utilize wholesalers if we could make those products to be able to fulfill them, or through a GPO, or through distribution to an A for dispensing purposes into particular shortage areas for shortage-based products. Obviously, there's a wholesale prohibition in the statute, and it wouldn't apply for those that aren't shortage-based products. But for those that are on ASHP's list or those that are shortage-based products, one thing that we have often said potentially could be helpful as an association, as an industry, is being able to sell to McKesson, for example, or Cardinal, or Amerisource, et cetera, and having them distribute into an area, particularly for those states like New York, right, where, not to knock the executive director of the New York Board of Pharmacy, but Dina's obviously very hard when it comes to getting a 503B license. And during the COVID situation, there was very few 503Bs who could provide into the state of New York only because of licensure issues and nothing else. And utilizing something like that for those shortage-based products, particularly for those that are on ASHP for a regional basis, would allow a 503B to be able to help fulfill some of those needs, to be able to sell to a wholesaler who could then distribute into the state of New York or any other hot spot that's ongoing at the moment, right, to be able to fulfill shortage-based product needs. So I know that we've got another comment here from Helen. And again, it looks like she's saying, as a pharmacy director, ongoing shortages have been a challenge for 2 to 3 years. And I would say as an industry, even beyond that, and COVID exacerbated this issue. Being able to pivot and dialogue with the end user should be a priority. And Helen, I agree with you. One of the things that, again, this is just speaking as we as the OFA, as an industry side of things, have often said is that's where 503Bs were meant to exist, right? And being able to pivot much faster than those in pharma, whether it be Deveau, you can go down Mylan, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, et cetera, Endo, Par, that we as an industry can move much faster when we have that ability to compound from bulk, helps us to meet some of those needs. Well, I know that we are running short on time, so I want to open it up to see if there are any other questions, comments from the group, or anybody who wanted to be unmuted to ask their questions or comments. And if not, Ian and Gabby, I'll turn it over to you guys first to see if there's any comments, impressions, anything else, questions that you would have either for anybody on the phone, because I know you wanted to mention the open dialogue. It's sort of a perfect opportunity to have that open dialogue with many of those other stakeholders, or to see if there's any questions or comments that you wanted to leave with.
Lee, did you get the question from Adrienne Eland about anticipating resuming in-person inspections?
I'll turn that over to Ian and Gabby now. Ian and Gabby, the question is, do you anticipate resuming in-person inspections for new facilities, or will those be pushed back as well?
I don't think we can say. Ian?
No, not explicitly on this. As indicated before, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, right now they're monitoring the domestic situation, determining which areas are relatively safe for investigators to enter, and what, which, as it relates to what facilities might be in that specific location. Beyond that, there's not much else I can share. It's how this opens up, how individual counties, I think it's down to that level, how they're faring at any particular time.
Ian, that actually brings up, and I know you can't really speak on behalf of Mr. Masso, but I've got a question for you related to that. Is if a 503A or a 503B is in a state that requires an FDA inspection every couple of years, right? We'll pick Virginia, for example. And because of that, they can't get a license in the state because FDA, and I'm not saying right or wrong, right, but just because they can't do the inspection at the moment. Is FDA planning on releasing a statement, or is there anything that they could release or provide to the 503A or 503B that just says, we're not doing inspections at the moment? Because that may be helpful for those who have to be inspected, right? Not by choice, but have to be to get their state licenses. It would provide them with some sort of material that they could provide to the state boards as to why they're not inspected, and sort of an enforcement discretion issue that they would at least have a document they could rely back on.
I will take that as an internal discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gabby, how about for you? Is there any comments, questions, or chances that you wanted to discuss here?
Well, if as mentioned, we really welcome feedback. If any folks participating today have feedback for us on particular provisions in the temporary guidances that you have found either more helpful than others, or if there's additional pieces that you want to ask about or make recommendations about, we're always very interested in hearing that sort of feedback, and really helps inform our thinking. So just would encourage folks, if you have any specific thoughts along those lines, to share them with us. And if anyone wants to chime in now on the phone, that's great too.
And Tom, how about you? Is there any last comments, questions, things that you'd like to leave with?
I think it's good to see everyone working together for the best interest of the patient, both from the science piece as well, or quality, and the regulatory piece.
Thank you. How about you, Ian? Is there anything that you wanted to leave with?
No, just
okay.
Gaby's words.
Okay.
Thank you. And I would be remiss if I didn't. Obviously, we're always open for comments, questions, dialogues. We look forward to working with the agency any way that we can. And one of the things that, from an industry perspective, that we have looked for, obviously some of the temp guidances, the more that we could move forward, whether it be the tail time period, the 90 days, whether it be the continuing expansion of bulks, right, to be able to help resolve some of these shortage situations, or the essential copy discussions, and its lack of ability or an ability from a finished product perspective and not applying. Obviously, any of those types of materials that we could help for, we as an association industry obviously would look forward to having with you as conversations, and anything that we can help, we're always here to help. And with Vivian, with that, I will turn it back over to you.